Hot and cold feel like opposites. They're not. They're one thing, temperature, measured at different points in a single scale. Cold is just less heat. There's no separate substance pouring in, only more or less of one thing. The Kybalion's Principle of Polarity says everything works this way. Love and hate, it claims, aren't different things. They're the same feeling, at two ends of one scale. And it goes further still. It claims the same is true of good and evil. Is that actually right? For love and hate, the case turns out to be surprisingly strong. For good and evil, it's one of the oldest, most contested questions in moral philosophy, and there's a real argument on both sides. Here's how the Kybalion actually states it. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. The claim has a specific structure worth being precise about. It's not saying opposites attract, or that life is about balance, or any of the softer things the word polarity sometimes gets used for. It's making a sharp, almost mathematical assertion that what we treat as opposite pairs are actually the same underlying thing, and the only real difference between them is degree. Take light and darkness. We talk about them as enemies, two forces. But darkness isn't a substance. It's the absence of light, which means dark and bright are just two readings on a single dimension of how much light is present. The Kybalion's move is to say, what's obviously true of light and dark, and of hot and cold, is also true of courage and fear, joy and despair, and, as we've already seen, even love and hate, even good and evil. That's a much bigger claim than anything a thermometer can support. So the real question is, does it hold up once you push it past the physics? The first thing worth knowing is that the Kybalion did not invent this idea, and the people who arrived at versions of it before were not lightweights. Around 500 years before the Common Era, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus built much of his thought around what's now called the unity of opposites, the idea that opposing states are bound together as aspects of one underlying reality. He pointed out that the road up and the road down are the same road, that the tension in a drawn bow pulling in two directions at once is exactly what makes it function. Strife and harmony for Heraclitus weren't enemies, they were partners in a single process. That intuition didn't die with him. The Stoics built a cosmology around a related principle of unifying reason running through all things, and over 2,000 years later, the philosopher Hegel constructed one of the most influential systems in Western thought, the dialectic, on a closely related foundation. The idea that contradiction and the tension of opposites aren't errors to be cleared away, but the very engine that drives reality and history forward. And in the 20th century, the psychologist Carl Jung made the tension of opposites central to his model of the human mind. The idea that psychological wholeness comes not from eliminating the dark side of ourselves, but from integrating it, holding the opposing forces in a single conscious whole. So when the Kybalion claims that opposites are one thing in different degrees, it's standing, knowingly or not, in a very old and very serious line of thought. That doesn't make it true. An idea having impressive ancestors is not the same as an idea being correct. But it does mean we can't wave it away as mere New Age invention. The intuition behind the principle of polarity is one that some of the most rigorous minds in history found worth building entire systems around. But the principle has real problems the moment you push on it, and they start with the examples it likes best. Hot and cold sit on one scale because cold is simply less heat, an absence. Light and dark work the same way, as we already saw. These feel like the principle's strongest evidence, but notice what's actually happening. They aren't really opposites at all. They're the presence and absence of one single quantity. Of course they sit on one scale. There was only ever one thing there to measure. Now take a pair where both ends are fully present, an acid and an alkali. Neither is the absence of the other. Acidity is an excess of one kind of ion, alkalinity an excess of another. Both are active, real, present. They do share the pH scale, but only because two genuine forces are being measured against each other, not because one is the dimming of the other. And notice what sits at the middle of that scale, not a fade to nothing, but a true neutral, pure water, both forces present and in perfect balance. That's worth a moment, because hot and cold have no real neutral, and neither do light and dark. They just slide toward zero. But some opposites resolve into a genuine third state. Neither pole, not the halfway point of a slide, but a real, stable thing in its own right. A principle insisting everything is two poles of one scale doesn't quite know what to do with a neutral that is itself a presence. This matters most when the principle reaches morality. Is evil simply the absence of good, a hole where something should have been? The Kybalion didn't invent that question, and it answered it the way a long and influential tradition did. Running through Augustine and Aquinas, that tradition argues evil has no positive existence of its own. It's privation, a lack, not a force. Cruelty, on this view, isn't a thing in its own right, but a deficiency, a failure of compassion that should have been present. If that's right, the Kybalion is in remarkably good company, quietly restating one of the oldest positions in moral philosophy: good and evil as one scale, evil being where good runs out. But the objection that has always haunted that view is serious. Sit with deliberate, inventive, sustained cruelty, and absence of good feels almost insultingly inadequate. The worst things people do don't feel like a hole where goodness should have been. They feel like a presence, something with its own energy and terrible momentum. Calling an atrocity a mere lack seems to miss something true, that real evil is often not passive absence at all, but active, willed, and disturbingly present. If that's right, evil isn't the cold end of one scale. It's its own thing, genuinely opposed to good rather than a lower reading of it. And the principle breaks down exactly where it matters most. This channel can't settle that. Both views have been argued for centuries, and neither has won. The point is narrower. The Kybalion takes one side of a genuinely open debate and presents it not as a contested position, but as a settled law of the universe. That's the overreach. Not that it's wrong, but that it claims certainty where some of the best minds who ever lived found only a question. And underneath it all sits the real problem. The principle is sold as a universal law, but it behaves like a useful lens. A law should hold everywhere, including the inconvenient cases, not just the tidy ones where a single quantity fades to absence. The principle of polarity is, at best, a very good lens the Kybalion overreaches by calling a law. Which raises the obvious question. If it's a lens rather than a law, is it a useful one? And here's where, having put the principle through real scrutiny, something useful survives. The Kybalion pairs the principle of polarity with a practice it calls mental transmutation. The reasoning goes like this. If fear and courage are the same thing at different degrees, rather than two separate states, then you don't have to manufacture courage out of nothing when you're afraid. You only have to move along a scale you're already standing on. Now, notice what scrutiny already did for us here. We established that the principle works least well for morality and best for things that do sit on a single scale. And emotional states are one of the places it works best. Modern psychology lends real support to the idea that many emotions exist on continuous spectrums rather than as discrete on-off categories. Fear and calm, despair and hope, agitation and ease. These really do behave like positions on a dimension you can move along, not like separate rooms you have to teleport between. So the practical claim, once it's survived the examination,
turns out to be one of the more defensible things in the whole book. Reframing a difficult emotion not as a fixed state you're trapped in, but as a position you can shift along a scale, is genuinely useful. And it lines up with how a lot of modern therapeutic practice actually works. You don't fight fear by pretending it's courage. You recognize it as the cold end of a scale whose warm end you also have access to, and you deliberately move. That's the part worth keeping. Not because it's ancient, not because the Kybalion said so, but because when you actually test it, it holds. So is the principle of polarity true? As a universal law of the cosmos, almost certainly not. It overreaches, it goes quiet about its own exceptions, and it smuggles a huge claim about morality in alongside an obvious claim about temperature. But as a lens, a way of seeing certain things, especially your own emotional states, it earns its place. Not all opposites are one thing in different degrees, but some genuinely are. And knowing which is which turns out to be quietly, practically powerful. If this kind of examination is what you're here for, there's a full investigation of the Kybalion's origins and all 7 of its principles on the channel.